Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We all know how frustrating it can be when you're trying to get a handle on a really complex issue, but all you find is surface level stuff.
Right, you just want to cut through the noise and get straight to the core insights, the stuff that actually matters.
That's exactly what we're all about here, and today we're taking a deep dive into something that's already generating a ton of buzz and has the potential to impact all of our wallets: Donald Trump's tariff policies.
We're going beyond the headlines, beyond the talking points. We've got economic data, analyses of past and present policies, reports on how other countries are reacting.
We're going to synthesize all of that for you so you can walk away with a solid understanding of what these tariffs could actually mean for you, for businesses, and for the U.S. economy as a whole.
And we'll do it without getting bogged down in jargon or making you feel like you need a PhD in economics.
So let's start with the basics for anyone who needs a quick refresher. When we talk about tariffs, what are we really talking about?
In the simplest terms, a tariff is a tax on goods that are imported from other countries.
And what happens when that tax gets slapped on those imported goods? Who ends up footing the bill?
Well, it might seem like the country exporting the goods is the one paying the price, but the reality is more complicated than that.
It usually ends up hitting us right here at home, doesn't it?
It often does. The data from Trump's first term as president really drove that point home. American businesses and consumers end up shouldering a large portion of the cost of those tariffs.
Okay, so can you give us a concrete example of that playing out in the real world?
Absolutely. Remember back in 2018 when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on washing machines imported from other countries?
I vaguely remember that, yeah.
Well, the research showed that the price of each washing machine sold in the U.S. jumped up by an average of $86.
86 bucks more just because of the tariff.
That's the average increase, and it adds up quickly. When you multiply that by the sheer number of washing machines sold in the U.S. every year, you're looking at an estimated cost of $1.5 billion annual to American consumers.
That's a staggering number for just one product. And now we're staring down the barrel of even more tariffs in 2025, targeting Canada, Mexico, and China. That's a huge chunk of our imports.
It is, and the scope of these proposed tariffs is pretty broad. We're talking about potential price increases on everything, from those avocados you get from Mexico to the electronics we rely on from China.
Even cars could get more expensive.
Right. A lot of the parts used in vehicles assembled here in the U.S. come from Canada and Mexico. So when you add it all up, experts are projecting that a typical middle-income household could see their annual expenses increase by anywhere from $1,700 to almost $4,000.
$4,000. That's a huge hit to a family's budget.
It's definitely something that families are going to feel.
Now, one of the big arguments in favor of tariffs is that they bring jobs back to America. We did see some of that during Trump's first term, right? Particularly in industries like steel and aluminum.
We did see some job creation in those sectors. After the tariffs were imposed, there was about $15.7 billion in new investments in steel and aluminum, which led to roughly 3,200 new jobs.
Okay, so on the surface, that sounds like a win for those industries and for American workers.
It does, but when you dig a little deeper, the picture gets a lot more complicated. Those 3,200 jobs came at a cost of roughly $900,000 per job created.
Wow, $900,000 per job.
That's the estimated cost, and a big chunk of that cost was passed on to consumers in the form of those higher prices we were just talking about. Also, while we did see job gains in steel and aluminum, other sectors of the economy that depend on imported materials or got caught in the crossfire of retaliatory tariffs from other countries actually saw job losses.
Right, because when we impose tariffs on goods from other countries, they often hit back with tariffs of their own. It's a tit-for-tat kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a classic trade war scenario. A 2021 study that looked at the overall impact of the first-term trade war found that when you factor in all of the job losses in those other sectors, there was actually a net loss of about 245,000 jobs.
So not exactly the clear-cut job creation victory that some folks might have hoped for.
Right. And when we look ahead to the potential impact of the 2025 tariffs, the projections get even murkier. There's one scenario where a 10% universal tariff, meaning a tariff on almost all imported goods, could lead to the creation of as many as 2.8 million new jobs. But that's only if U.S. manufacturing sees a massive surge in growth.
That sounds like a pretty big if.
It is a big if, and there are other factors that could completely negate those job gains. Retaliation from other countries is a major concern. If they respond with tariffs of their own, it could offset any job creation we see here. We also have to consider the potential disruptions to global supply chains.
Right, those complex networks of companies and suppliers that span the globe. They're how so many products get made and delivered.
Exactly. And tariffs can really throw a wrench in those delicate systems. Disruptions to supply chains can lead to higher costs, production delays, and even shortages of essential goods. All this could potentially drag down the overall U.S. economy. Some experts are projecting a potential 0.8% reduction in U.S. GDP as a result of these broader tariffs.
And GDP, just to remind folks, that stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it's basically a measure of the overall size and health of a country's economy.
That's a good way to put it. It's the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders.
So if GDP shrinks, it means the economy is contracting, which is generally not a good thing.
Right. And when we look at the various analyses that have been done, it does seem like there's a strong possibility that the 2025 tariffs could lead to at least a temporary reduction in GDP. The Tax Foundation, for example, is predicting a 0.7% drop directly from the tariffs, with an additional 0.1% decline expected due to retaliation from other countries.
So almost a full percentage point knocked off the U.S. economy. That's not insignificant.
It's definitely something to be concerned about.
Now, we've talked about jobs, we've talked about GDP. Another big goal of these tariffs has been to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. As of 2024, that deficit was over $1.2 trillion. Did the tariffs implemented during Trump's first term have any real impact on that?
That's one of the more interesting aspects of this whole situation. While the first round of tariffs did lead to a decrease in imports from China specifically, we actually saw the trade deficit increase with other countries.
So we were importing less from China, but more from somewhere else.
Essentially, yes. So overall, the total U.S. trade deficit remained pretty much unchanged, or in some cases, actually got worse.
So it seems like that particular goal wasn't really achieved. And what about the 2025 tariffs? Are they likely to have a different impact?
The 2025 tariffs, which are structured as reciprocal tariffs, meaning they vary based on the tariffs other countries impose on us, could definitely lead to further shifts in global trade patterns. We might see a decrease in imports from certain countries and an increase from others. However, there's a real question about whether they will actually shrink the overall U.S. trade deficit.
Because ultimately, a trade deficit is a complex issue driven by a lot of different factors. It's not just about tariffs.
Right. Things like consumer demand here in the U.S., national savings rates, the relative strength of different currencies, all of those play a role. So there's a real possibility that these tariffs will simply shuffle the deck in terms of who we're trading with without actually addressing the root causes of the deficit.
Now, we've been focusing a lot on the direct economic consequences, but obviously these kinds of policies don't happen in a vacuum. They can have big ripple effects on our relationships with other countries, on global trade, on geopolitics. What are some of the potential consequences we're looking at on that front?
There's no doubt that these tariffs are going to have a significant impact on the global stage. One of the most immediate concerns is the potential for retaliation from our trading partners. We saw this play out in 2018 when China responded to U.S. tariffs by targeting American farmers with tariffs of their own.
Right, they specifically went after agricultural products, which had a big impact on certain parts of the U.S.
It did. The government did try to step in with some financial aid to help those farmers, but it often wasn't enough to fully make up for the losses they suffered. And now, in 2025, it seems like other major trading partners are getting ready to push back even harder.
What are we seeing from other countries?
Well, Canada, for example, has already announced that they're going to impose a 25% tariff on vehicles imported from the U.S. in direct response to the proposed U.S. tariffs. Japan has also expressed its strong disapproval and already has a 24% tariff in place on certain U.S. goods. The European Union is seriously considering what countermeasures they might need to take.
So we're already seeing concrete actions, not just talk.
Right, and this is exactly the kind of tit-for-tat escalation that can lead to a full-blown trade war, where everybody keeps raising tariffs and everybody loses in the end. This kind of conflict can have a devastating impact on the global economy. JP Morgan, for example, has estimated that there's a 60% chance of a global recession by the end of 2025.
60%.
Yeah.
It's a pretty dire prediction. And they're saying that trade tensions are a big part of why they're so worried.
That's right. They see these escalating trade conflicts as a major contributing factor to the risk of a global recession.
Now, it's not just about tariffs on finished products that we buy in stores, right? This also impacts the incredibly complex supply chains that companies all over the world rely on.
Exactly. Those supply chains are the backbone of a global economy, and they're particularly interconnected here in North America. The proposed 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, who are key suppliers of things like auto parts and energy, could really disrupt those systems.
Are we already seeing any examples of that happening?
There have been reports that Stellantis, the automaker, has had to pause some of its operations in both Canada and Mexico in April 2025 because of concerns about the impact of these tariffs.
So we're already seeing real-world consequences.
Right, and those kinds of disruptions can ripple throughout the entire supply chain. A factory in the US might suddenly find itself unable to get the parts it needs from Canada or Mexico, which could force them to halt production, leading to delays and potentially even higher prices for consumers.
And those higher prices could hit consumers in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. We've already mentioned the potential increase in car prices, which could be as much as $2,700 per vehicle on average. But we could also see price hikes on things like lumber, which would make new homes more expensive, or on oil and gas, which would impact energy costs. It's a ripple effect that can touch almost every part of the economy.
It sounds like these more aggressive tariff policies could also put a serious strain on our relationships with countries that are typically considered close allies.
That's a very real concern. Canada, Mexico, and the European Union have all expressed strong criticism of these measures. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has warned that these tariffs could have dire consequences for transatlantic relations.
So there's a real risk of damaging those relationships.
There is. And if we push our allies too far, it could lead to a situation where the U.S. becomes more isolated on the global stage. We could see a weakening of trade agreements that have benefited us in the past, like the USMCA, and we could see other countries forging new alliances and trade blocs that don't include the United States.
So the potential consequences go far beyond just economics. This could have major implications for America's global standing and influence.
It definitely could.
Now, shifting our focus back to the domestic front, beyond the higher prices we've already discussed, what are some of the other potential consequences of these tariffs that we might see here in the U.S.?
Well, inflation is a major concern. We're already dealing with elevated inflation rates, and tariffs, by their very nature, are inflationary. They increase the cost of imported goods, which puts upward pressure on prices across the economy.
So they could make it even harder to bring inflation under control.
That's the worry. And we're already seeing some early signs of this happening. There have been reports of consumers stockpiling goods in anticipation of future price increases, and businesses are starting to raise their prices in response to the tariffs. This creates a real challenge for the Federal Reserve, which is trying to get inflation back down to its target rate of 2%.
You know, it's interesting because I remember Janet Yellen, back when she was Treasury Secretary, suggesting that tariffs don't necessarily lead to higher prices for consumers.
I remember that too. It's important to remember that there are always different perspectives on these complex economic issues. However, the general consensus among economists is that tariffs do indeed increase costs for businesses, and those costs are often passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices.
So while there might be some debate about the specifics, the overall impact is likely to be inflationary.
That's the most likely scenario.
Now, another argument that's often made in favor of tariffs is that they're necessary for national security. How does that justification factor into these policies?
The Trump administration has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to justify these tariffs. They've cited a range of national security concerns, from the need to combat drug trafficking to addressing trade imbalances with countries that they view as economic rivals.
So they're arguing that these tariffs are necessary to protect key industries and address potential threats.
That's the argument. They also point to the need to strengthen domestic industries that are considered vital for national defense, like steel production.
So the idea is that we need to be able to produce those things here at home, even if it's more expensive, because we can't rely on other countries for them.
Exactly. But there are a lot of critics who argue that this is a very broad interpretation of national security. They say that applying these tariffs so widely, even to imports from close allies like Canada, overstates the actual security benefits. They also worry that this approach could backfire by damaging relationships with those allies and making it harder to cooperate on genuine security threats.
And there's also the legal question. Could these tariffs be challenged in court?
That's another potential wrinkle. Using the IEPA to justify such broad tariffs is fairly unprecedented, and there's a good chance that it will face legal challenges from affected countries and possibly even from businesses here in the U.S.
So it's a complex legal issue as well as an economic one.
Absolutely.
Now, politically speaking, how are these tariffs likely to play out here in the U.S.? We saw some areas, particularly industrial regions, show strong support for tariffs during Trump's first term. Do you think that same sentiment still exists?
There's no doubt that tariffs resonate with a certain segment of the electorate, particularly in those industrial regions that have been hit hard by job losses in manufacturing. It's a message of economic nationalism, of protecting American jobs and American industries that can be very appealing, even if the economic realities are more complex.
And Trump is framing these new tariffs as Liberation Day for American workers.
That's right, and that kind of framing is likely to appeal to that same base of support. But it's also important to note that there's growing opposition to these tariffs as well. Economists across the political spectrum are expressing serious concerns about the potential negative consequences. They worry about higher prices for consumers, job losses in sectors that depend on imports, and damage to relationships with our trading partners.
So it's a politically divisive issue with strong feelings on both sides.
It definitely is. And it will be interesting to see how it all plays out politically as these tariffs are implemented and their effects start to be felt.
Now, when we step back and look at the big picture, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about the ultimate impact of these tariffs. It depends on how they're implemented, how other countries respond, how businesses and consumers adjust their behavior. But what are some of the key things that you'll be watching for in the coming months and years as these policies play out?
That's a great question. There are a lot of moving parts to this, so it's important to keep an eye on a few key indicators. One is inflation. If we see a significant spike in inflation, particularly in consumer goods, that will be a clear sign that the tariffs are having a negative impact. Another thing to watch is job growth. Did we actually see significant job creation in those industries that were supposed to benefit from the tariffs? Or did we see job losses in other sectors that were hurt by retaliation or supply chain disruptions? And finally, I'll be watching the trade deficit very closely. Did the tariffs actually succeed in reducing the overall trade deficit, or did they simply shift trade patterns without having a real impact on the fundamental imbalance?
So it's about looking beyond the rhetoric and the headlines and really digging into the data to see what's actually happening.
Exactly. That's the only way to get a clear picture of the real consequences of these policies.
Okay, so to sum it all up for everyone listening, Donald Trump's tariff policies are a complex and controversial issue with far-reaching implications. We're potentially looking at higher prices, job disruptions, a slowdown in economic growth, strained relationships with our allies, and a risk of an escalating trade war.
And it's important to remember that this is just the beginning. The full impact of these policies is still unfolding, and there are a lot of uncertainties about how it will all play out. But one thing is for sure, these tariffs are a gamble, and it's a gamble with very high stakes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, the potential benefits, the potential risks, the uncertainties, what are the specific things that you will be watching for in the coming months and years to determine whether these tariffs are ultimately a success or a failure? And are there any potential consequences, any unintended ripple effects that we haven't even considered yet? Think about it and let us know what you come up with.
This is an issue that's going to be with us for a while, so staying informed and engaged is more important than ever.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a complex and timely issue.
Until then, stay curious.